Okay, now I have to also try not to cry. Um, so a few thank yous to start. A huge thank you to Dean Anderson and to Professor Zarneski for bringing me to PACE. And I think because you're leaving, this will be my only chance to say publicly how extraordinarily grateful I am, not just for hiring me, but for the last decade of loyal mentorship and friendship that you have provided. And I cannot, there are no words for how much I will miss you here. So thank you. Thank you also to my mother and my dad who's listening from home, and my sister and partner who are also both here, Noah in particular, for never letting me get away with anything intellectually. I'm grateful for that. And then thanks also to all of my fantastic research assistants who have helped bring this project together: Alexa Williamson, Ashley Gentile, and Amanda McKenzie. You have all been fantastic. So make sure there we go. All right. I realize I switched the order of the words here, but that doesn't matter. So I named this project about a year ago when I was just beginning to work on it. And sitting down to write this talk, I've been reflecting on how much the world has changed since January 20th. Inundation as a metaphor has suddenly become quite ubiquitous. Journalists, political commentators, academics have been using the phrase flooding the zone to understand the tactics of the Trump regime. And used in this context, the term has a very particular meaning. As explained by Steve Bannon, the architect himself, it is about distraction. Bannon spoke in particular about distracting the media, keeping them scrambling to report on outrage after outrage. The goal is to use overwhelm to make it harder for anyone to understand what is really going on and to fragment response. And it's working. I have never experienced anything more disempowering than the deluge of unconstitutional, inhumane, and outright terrifying acts of the Trump regime. I contemplated renaming my project. How could a phenomenon that predates January 20th be a flood? This is the flood. But on further reflection, one of the things that is striking to me about this feeling of overwhelm that I have now is that it is familiar. I have always imagined that fascism would feel like something new. But in fact, while the stakes now are higher and the dangers more immediate, the Trump regime has only exaggerated something that was there already. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. One of the primary features of modernity is that human bodies are subject to constant physical inundation. And I'm going to talk about the bad ones, from toxins, noises, bullets, radiation, and many other things. How well legal regimes, and here I mean both public and private law, respond to this condition is, to me, a really important metric of good governance. Here in the United States, inundation management does not paint a picture of good governance, and it has not for a very long time. Instead, it has for decades been priming us to become fascist subjects. What do I mean by that? Regulatory approaches overwhelm and distract in a way that is not at all unlike what the Trump regime is doing now. They prime people to take individual responsibility and not to expect much from government or from each other, positioning many people to accept fascism without resistance. They stoke obsession with bodily purity, which is a primary building block for projects of racial and gender oppression. To explain all of this, I want to do three things in this talk. First, I want to define inundation and make the case that it is an essential unit of analysis. Second, I want to offer a taxonomy of regulatory approaches to inundation. And finally, I want to explore some of the consequences of these approaches for individuals and for regulators. First, a little note on vocabulary. I use instruments of intrusion throughout the talk to refer to the many things, the chemicals, the bullets, the noise that may enter human bodies. I use intrusion to describe that entrance on the assumption that a lot of the time that entrance is non-consensual. I use saturation to refer to the extent that instruments of intrusion flood the environment, thus making people susceptible to intrusion. And finally, I use inundation to refer to the collective phenomenon of large volumes of different types of intrusion. So a little more on what I mean by inundation. Consider the course of your daily life. How many times a day are you exposed to toxic pollution? Perhaps you live near a highway or a bus depot, or a row of cars sits outside your apartment idling every morning during alternate side parking. Perhaps you drank a glass of water. Perhaps you touched a receipt, or you had your apartment treated for a roach infestation. I hope not. How many times a day did you walk into a public space and scan for the exits so you would be prepared in case of a shooting? Have you ever covered your ears as a siren went by, or worn a mask, or purchased organic produce, or checked ingredients on a food or a skincare label? The overall experience is inundation, the overwhelm of constant physical invasion. Not every intrusion is unwanted. Some, like vaccines, can be life-saving. Others, like nitrates or bullets, are deadly. Often intrusion is somewhere in between. It generates annoyance, distraction, pain. Individually, most intrusion is innocuous, but collectively, it is life-altering and can generate enormous pain, both physical and emotional. Inundation includes a broad range of harms, but what they all have in common is that the harms flow from the permeability of the human body. We are physical sponges, and we have no choice but to move through the world as such. And when I say inundation, I imagine a lot of you started thinking about social media and digital addiction. And there is certainly an inundation there, a profound one, which plays a role in, but is not the primary story that I want to tell today. I want to focus on the physical invasion of our bodies. So how does the United States govern inundation? How has it governed inundation for the past 30, 40, 50 years? Across spheres, regulation governing intrusion follows a similar pattern. Prevention is rare. Instead, the dominant form of regulation relies on individuals, institutions, and communities to establish shields at their own boundaries and to clean up after intrusion has occurred. So what do I mean by prevention? It is the regulation that would actually obviate the possibility of intrusion in the first place. So the most straightforward example would just be a ban on the manufacture, sale, possession of an instrument of intrusion. These bans occur, but they are relatively uncommon. There are some, the 1972 ban on DDT. In case you can't see the font, this is an ad for DDT-laced wallpaper to keep the mosquitoes from biting your children. A 2015 ban on artificial trans fats. New York led the way here with a ban in 2006. New York City, that is, not the state. Congress in 1986 banned machine guns. But these are mostly the exception. Most inundation law is not preventative. Now, those of you taking environmental law may want to quibble with that a bit and say environmental law does a lot of work to reduce toxins in the environment. And that's true to some extent, but it is not fundamentally preventative. Why not? Most pollution control law falls into one of two categories. The first category are permitting programs. Permits agencies issue permits to entities that have applied to emit pollutants into the environment. So they do exactly that. They permit or authorize pollution. Thus, as environmental justice scholars have been arguing for decades, pollution is a structural feature of permit programs rather than the occasional accident. So for instance, I pulled up here on the slide a map of facilities in this neighborhood that have Clean Water Act permits. Called out on the right is the White Plains Bus Company at 14 Fisher Avenue, which happens to have a recent Clean Water Act violation. But many of the others do not. They are all discharging pollutants into waters of the United States. The second category of environmental law is registration programs. These programs apply to companies seeking to manufacture and sell toxic substances. And although they are occasionally successful in excluding some number of substances from the market, none of them controls for the overall level of manufacture and use of toxic substances. So even after a few are banned, overall toxic loading in the environment continues to rise. And this is just pesticides in particular, but we could look at parallel images for all other kinds of toxic substances. So if not prevention, what does inundation law do? Well, it does two things primarily. The first is that it allows us to self-shield. The primary way that it does this is through information disclosure. These are virtual shields, mandatory disclosure regimes that give individuals information that they can use to try and protect themselves. I emphasize the word try there. So some examples. Ingredient disclosures under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, pesticide warning and safe use labels under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, warning labels on consumer products, or in some cases places, as in Prop 65 in California. Safe Drinking Water Act water quality reports that if you pay attention to your snail mail, you get about once a year from your drinking water utility if you live in a place that has a drinking water utility. And there are many, many, many others. Then there are also some shield programs that are more focused on actual physical shields. Mandatory PPE laws. There's an acronym that you all know now that I don't have to define. For instance, requirements that you wear certain PPE to engage in pesticide application, metal detectors in schools and in airports, local bans on pesticide spraying, fences to keep people out of contaminated locations. These are all examples of physical barriers. Beyond self-shielding, the law also creates some space for cleanup. And I want to distinguish here between laws that facilitate cleanup of the environment and laws that facilitate cleanup of bodies. Cleaning up the environment is actually a form of shielding because it is a mechanism to remove contaminants from the environment before they reach our bodies. So some examples of this: the Safe Drinking Water Act mandates water treatment and filtration before it reaches our tap. The Superfund Act mandates and sets standards for cleanup of toxic sites that have certain threshold levels of pollutants in them. A lot of communities use gun buyback programs, prescription drug collection programs to try to sweep in instruments of intrusion before they affect people. Cleaning up bodies, on the other hand, is really more about healthcare law. So I'm talking here about things like medical monitoring, for instance, under the 2022 PACT Act, which provides coverage for veterans with certain kinds of toxic exposures to get regular testing. Other kinds of healthcare mandates. For instance, a growing number of states provide financial assistance for reproduction. And I include that as a cleanup regime because while there are many causes of infertility, toxic exposure is one of them. There are also laws governing ERs, right, requiring treatment of gunshot victims, for instance. Tort law and property law also play an important role here. Common law tort actions can be a mechanism for individuals to recover, to get compensation to cover medical costs and pain and suffering. But these are pretty limited. There are a lot of causation hurdles to being successful in these suits. And in some contexts, they are barred completely by statute. So for instance, the 2005 Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act shields gun manufacturers from tort liability associated with gun violence in most cases. So this is the law. People can take action to protect themselves and sometimes seek relief when those efforts fail. So we've arrived at the so what. This legal framework cultivates perfect fascist subjects. How does it do that? Distracts us with mental intrusion, trains us to take responsibility for ourselves and not to expect much from government. And then it actually replicates this pattern by inundating regulators themselves, undermining potential for more robust prevention and eroding faith in the capacity of government. So let me say a little bit more about each of these pieces of the argument. Filtered water from the admissions office. So one, shield and cleanup law distract us with mental intrusion. This begins with anxiety. There is strong evidence that inundation generates anxiety and fear. Fear of gun violence is particularly acute, but fear and anxiety associated with toxic exposure, particularly in frontline communities, can also be severe. Mental intrusion also flows from overwhelm that some people experience when trying to implement shields in their own lives. What is overwhelming? Well, for one, information sorting. Particularly in the era of social media, sorting and prioritizing information is nearly impossible. In addition to the public sources of information that I described earlier, all of those mandatory disclosures, there is the internet noise that teaches fear of vaccines, of 5G, of seed oils, of color dyes, of BPA-coded receipts. That last one is real. People are forced to become their own data gatherers, their own peer reviewers, their own meta-studiers. And this is only the start of the work. Sorting information is the precursor to actually implementing shields. What does that entail? Well, for some people, DIY cleaning products, staying inside on air quality alert days, investing money in air filters and expensive clean skincare products, changing daily patterns to avoid certain kinds of public spaces. And a side note here, these graphics come from a company that describes itself as an intelligent video analytics company selling technology to use existing security cameras to detect weapons and send alerts to first responders. So I'll come back to this later. There's money to be made here. But time, money, brain space, all poured in to self-shielding instead of community organizing, political advocacy, writing poetry. I do not mean to say that those things are not happening. They are, but I think they're happening less than they otherwise might. So this brings me to my second point. Shield regimes don't just distract, they train people to take personal responsibility for their own health. In many ways, this is just a classic neoliberal story about responsibilization. Devolve government function onto private individuals in a way that allows you to blame them for their own suffering, distract attention from the corporate entities profiting at every stage along the process. Oops. Their slides are in the wrong order. Who are our inundation profiteers? They are the purveyors of instruments of intrusion, the chemical and gun manufacturers, the purveyors of information, social media, but also private water and air testing companies, nutritionists, wellness counselors. They are the purveyors of shield products, air and water filter manufacturers, home security system manufacturers, metal detector and bulletproof vest manufacturers, and they are the purveyors of healthcare, hospitals, drug manufacturers, fertility doctors, dermatologists, therapists. You might say, actually, that inundation is driving economic growth. You would be missing the point. Scholars in the field of health and environmental justice have long since established that health is about far more than individual choice. And yet, so many of us employ the tools of shield and cleanup. I do not have the empirical evidence to support the claim that as a result of these efforts, we demand less in the way of systemic prevention, but I offer it as a hypothesis. These regimes train people to take personal responsibility and to blame ourselves and each other when harm strikes. One more note about the anxiety and labor of shield and cleanup. This work is highly gendered. Consider some of the sources of information on the internet providing information about toxic exposure. Cleanmama.net, Clean Mama's Guide to a Healthy Home, Mama Sense, Mindful Mama, Mamavation. You see the theme. The Mamavation website description is particularly revealing. Now, bear with me, this is a bit of a long quote, but I think it's worth it. Whether you're the greenest mom on the block or just getting started, I know you'll find this blog to be a valuable resource on your journey to dumbing down the amount of hormone-disrupting chemicals that your family is exposed to. Don't worry if you're just getting started. My life used to be full of chemicals, including daily fast food trips, microwaving and plastic, using dangerous chemicals on my skin, and smoking. Other than smoking, I had no idea that those actions could harm my health or later my family's. I'm not here to judge, just to help you be the superstar of your domicile. After discovering that hormone-disrupting chemicals are linked to most of the chronic diseases we find in the modern world, I was on a mission to curtail that epidemic in my own family. How do you go about getting rid of all these dangerous chemicals? There was information out there from companies and industry groups, but I didn't trust it. Over the last several years, I did hundreds of interviews with scientists, doctors, and other professionals, brought on several advisors, and went forth in condensing everything for simplicity so I could share it. The outcome was this blog, our community, and my first book. Okay, so a few observations about this statement. First, it reflects this particular mother's sense of obligation to shield her family, not the general public, her family, and eventually her customers. It also reflects her sense of guilt for not having done so already, demonstrates her willingness to invest a significant amount of time into the work that's required to do it. It shows her distrust of available sources of information. And most meaningfully to me, nowhere in the statement or anywhere else really on the website does she contemplate the possibility of a regulatory response. The responsibility is hers and hers alone, and by extension, mine and that of all other female-bodied people. In this way, shield and cleanup regimes play a role in the current fascist project of reestablishing traditional gender roles, but with a modern late capitalist twist. The modern trad wife takes on the persona of the perfect wife and mother, protecting her family from toxic exposure with homemade everything. But she's also operating a business, capitalizing on the anxiety of others out there who will be willing to buy her book, buy the products she's promoting on her Amazon page, click on her social media posts enough times that advertisers will pay her. Public governance is not part of the conversation. So this brings me to the final component of my argument that inundation law has slowly been molding fascist subjects. The infrastructure of regulatory law inundates regulators too. Three features of regulatory law contribute to this phenomenon. First, modern risk management operates on a whack-a-mole theory. Second, the law of administrative process slows the game to a crawl. And finally, the predominance of cost-benefit analysis as a guide for regulatory decision-making crowds out the opportunity for engagement with actual human experience. So the whack-a-mole theory of risk management takes individual instruments of intrusion on a case-by-case basis. And I want to just say, I was looking for just a photo of the arcade game, did not know that this is something you two could rent for your own backyard party. But what I actually really like about it is that it replaces the moles with people. So if the moles might represent natural phenomenon that no one is responsible for, the people represent the private businesses choosing to profit from production of harmful instruments of intrusion. Yeah, so maybe I need to go ahead to the next slide. So although there's a logic to the whack-a-mole approach, right? Each potential instrument of intrusion has its own harm profile, its own benefits of use, but the vast number of potential instruments makes this approach paralyzing for regulators. So this pattern repeats across so many different regulatory contexts: the Toxic Substances Control Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, the Clean Air Act, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and many others. Each of these statutes sets out a separate approach for risk assessment, which is the process of deciding what is harmful enough to bother regulating and how harmful is it, how much do we need to regulate it. So the Toxic Substance Control Act provides an illustrative example. This is a statute that governs the production, import, use, and disposal of a broad range of toxic substances. Most are governed under generic provisions that direct the EPA to require testing on a substance-by-substance basis to assess health and environmental effects if there's any concern the substance may present an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. At the time the statute was passed in the 1970s, the EPA faced the task of inventorying 62,000 distinct substances. And that list has just been growing by about almost another 30,000 in the last several decades. Administrative process only adds to this burden. Tiny font, can't read the slide. That's kind of the point. To promulgate a new regulation, regulators must complete notice and comment, comply with the exacting standards of hard look review, engage meaningfully with comments, conduct cost-benefit analysis, and seek internal review with the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and in some cases, develop an environmental impact statement, comply with the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, and a host of other things that this chart calls, in that bottom square all the way at the bottom, other potential analyses. This is a government-produced regulatory map that maps out each of the steps of the process. Many of these procedures have value, which my administrative law students can tell you all about, but they also slow down regulatory action in really profound ways. Focusing on regulatory outcomes, admin law scholars call this regulatory ossification. But focusing on the bureaucrats themselves who have to do this work, I see this as another form of inundation. The irony of the inundation of regulators is that the resulting regulatory failures help to undermine the legitimacy of prevention endeavors, further entrenching attitudes about the preferability of self-help regimes. Regulatory endeavors become both stories of government incompetence and also of regulatory overreach and the excesses of modern bureaucracy. The story of artificial trans fat provides an illustration of this phenomenon. Artificial trans fats were introduced in the early part of the 20th century, but by the early 1990s, there was pretty good evidence that they're quite bad for us. So you would see these things on food ingredient labels as partially hydrogenated oils. But maybe a lot of you don't remember them because they've been gone for a little bit now. By the early 1990s, there was pretty good studies suggesting that they contributed to about 20,000 premature deaths every year. In 2015, after several petitions, a lawsuit, a bunch of intermediate actions, the FDA finally issued a ban. In 2018, just before the original compliance deadline, the FDA extended the compliance deadline for some uses for another 3 years. So from the issue formally coming to the agency's attention to the removal of the ingredient, we have a period of 25 to 28 years. If you're doing the math, that's about 500,000 premature deaths that could have been prevented if the agency had acted faster. So why did it take so long? Well, lobbying is, of course, a big part of the story. Public resistance is also a part of the story. But so is risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis and notice and comment rulemaking. And if you take a deeper dive into that timeline, you see for a lot of that time, the FDA was acting just really, really, really slowly. So it's no wonder that on learning that cleaning products might increase toxic exposure for her within her home, Mamavation doesn't turn to federal law for help. She's worried about her children, not her grandchildren. There's one final feature of the administrative process that bears mention. The regulatory process relies heavily on cost-benefit analysis. To the extent that there is very little space for regulators to grapple with actual human experience. So while commenters in Notice and Comment are free to tell their own stories and share those experiences, the final regulatory documents are cold and clinical. One quick example illustrates this phenomenon. In 2018, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms promulgated a rule banning bump stocks, an accessory that functionally turns a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic one. Although the rulemaking document makes passing mention to the 2015 massacre in Las Vegas, in which 58 people were murdered and 500 more wounded with a weapon augmented with a bump stock, nothing in the document explores the meaning of that experience. Indeed, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms describes the affected population of the rule to include bump stock manufacturers, their employees, distributors of bump stocks, and owners of bump stocks. Who's missing from that list? Gunshot victims, their friends, their family, the general public living in fear of mass shootings. So what? Who reads these regulatory documents anyway? Well, judges do. Yeah. These documents set a tone for discourse, and it is a discourse that is grounded in dollars and cents and not in lived life. The Supreme Court rejected the bump stock rule in 2023, right, effectively eliminating the ban. And like the ATF's regulatory document, its decision is quite clinical. Would the court have decided the case differently if the regulatory document had looked different? Well, probably not. But it might have been harder for the court to decide in the way that it did. Okay, I want to take a step back now and try to pull all of these threads together. Inundation is a feature of modern life. The neoliberal regimes that have evolved in the last several decades to manage that inundation emphasize personal responsibility and narrow the role of government to facilitate private action to shield and clean up after inundation occurs. The neoliberal regime prepares the populace for the fascist regime. How? In addition to physical harm, inundation generates significant emotional harm that flows from the fear. Operation of shield and cleanup regimes exacerbate that emotional harm by generating significant amounts of labor, particularly for women in heteronormative family structures. Together, this anxiety and the labor takes up time and emotional capacity that would be necessary for democratic political engagement. They also reinforce the sense of individual responsibility that allows people to accept a government unwilling to protect their physical and emotional well-being. In parallel, regulators who might otherwise use the potentially powerful legal tools at their disposal must wade through the quagmire of risk assessment, cost-benefit analysis, and administrative procedure. Their capacity to take action by traditional means is slowed, and their analytical tools push disconnection with lived human life. This reinforces public sentiment regarding the need for self-protection. And now, here we are at the onset of the fascist regime. And what of inundations? Well, on the one hand, President Trump is working steadily to erode administrative procedure, for instance, by systematically bypassing notice and comment rulemaking. On the other hand, he is simultaneously slashing agency capacity, firing tens of thousands of employees whose work included monitoring disease outbreaks, researching toxic harms, enforcing the limited prevention law that was on the books. And he is directing agencies to cease enforcement work in a wide variety of contexts. All hands point toward a one-way ratchet. Elimination of any of the existing regulatory structures that reduced saturation of instruments of intrusion. And against that backdrop, a large number of people who have been trained not to expect government help. I don't want to oversimplify that picture. According to a 2021 Pew survey, a significant percentage of Americans believe that it is the responsibility of government to ensure clean air and water. And there are a lot of people, including many people in this room, dedicated to holding the federal government to account for compliance with environmental law. And I hope you will continue. For as long as bodies remain permeable, physical inundation remains a critical unit of analysis for human experience. Permeability creates mutual dependence. Self-shielding serves primarily to drive us further apart. And we have only to look at the long-term effects of COVID lockdown to see a society-wide experiment with this phenomenon. Resisting fascism will require profound collective action. Shield and cleanup regimes did not cause fascism, but I do think that they have weakened our capacity for collective action. I invite you to prove me wrong. Thank you.
Time for some questions. There's a roving mic, which we'll pass around. With the question behind you.
Oh.
And,
Do we have?
Okay, is it ready?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Margot, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Most impressive. Here's my question. You talked about inundation as a feature of modern life. You mentioned the American political condition today, and you use most of the word fascism many times. So what I'm asking you is this a national phenomenon, inundation, or is it a worldwide phenomenon? If there was a speaker in any one of the countries that, modern Western industrialized countries, England, Spain, India, Japan, and they were talking to their students about inundation, would they be saying the same thing you're saying? Would they be more hopeful? Would they be more pessimistic than you are?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah. I think it is mostly a global phenomenon. And that's true because if we go back to, here we go, to this, right? This is a global phenomenon, right? We're talking about a global capitalist system in which all of these instruments of intrusion are making some people very, very, very rich. So I do think it's a global phenomenon. I think if we did a country by country analysis, we would get a good deal of variation on how much prevention law there is, right? So the EU on some measures of inundation has been much more successful, right? Gun law, for instance, right? We're an outlier there, right? So I think the kind of precise portfolio of or balance of prevention versus shield and cleanup, we would get a lot of variation around the world. Leslie. Thank you.
And to what extent is that this lack of regulation for things that are causing inundation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think COVID exhausted people, right? COVID involved all of us taking fairly extreme action in the interest of public health, right? Even many of us who were not ourselves going to be at some serious risk from COVID exposure. So I do think that there was a kind of enough already of this. I don't want to have to kind of be invested in these communal public health projects anymore. But I think that COVID just exposed something that was already there, right? And most of the laws and the picture that I'm talking about all predate COVID, right? So I think it exaggerated the personal responsibility I'm in it for me and my family piece to a large extent.
I'll ask my own question. One question I have is, so where would you start? So there, and I, in particular, where would we start on things where, you just say, oh, we just ban guns or give us national health care. I'm thinking of like the Japanese context where all public schools in Japan have their own nutritionists. All the food in Japan in public schools has to be from whole ingredients. There can even be no pre-made pastes or anything, and students are taught about their nutrition. So where, if you we had investment in a social program, you have to start somewhere. Where would you, given the nature of inundations and how they affect your health, where would you start that investment?
That's such a hard question, and in part because I think choosing one place to start actually just risks replicating the problem by problem approach, right? And one of the things, right, I view this project as sort of a project of diagnosis rather than a project of prescription, in part because I don't have an answer to your question, but in part because I really think that part of where we have gone wrong is by looking at this as a substance by substance, toxic harm, inundation by inundation issue, rather than being able to see the phenomenon as a whole. And it's because so much of the harm is about the cumulative overwhelm of inundations rather than any one particular thing, right? So you never, if you pick any one thing to start from, you're never going to see the whole picture, right? So where does that leave us on where to start? I have no idea. I mean, I think that I'm talking about a kind of really fundamental reordering. And I don't have a roadmap for that.
I just wanted to ask about, I think you do it really, it's a very convincing argument that the sort of this self-help, this idea that we have to help ourselves because government's not going to piece of this. But I also feel like particularly during COVID, there was a demonization of the government for even trying to help us, right? Like, how dare you try to keep us safe from each other? How dare you try to vaccinate, right? Do you think that's also part of like creating the fascist regime that we're willing to say the government has to stay out?
Yeah. I mean, I think a huge part of that was the distrust piece, right? The kind of sense that the government is not our savior, right? Which the right has been drilling into people for decades, right? So if you start with a sort of baseline of this is not an entity that I trust to protect me, then when it tells me I have to get a shot in my arm, I'm going to be really skeptical. So I mean, yes, right. Then we're talking about a kind of a feedback loop, right? Where the phenomenon of thinking only I can protect myself will lead me to be skeptical if the government actually does try and do something. Nick.
Hi, Margot. Thanks for a brilliant presentation and your analysis. At the beginning of environmental law, we were told we can't take protective action because you haven't proven it. And we want to see the science.
Yeah.
Now that we have the science, don't want to believe the science.
Yeah.
But the suspicion of science as a legitimate guide, scientific knowledge, permeates a lot of your analysis, and you haven't given us your thoughts on that. And it's relevant now because, for instance, fluoride in drinking water is under attack for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
And that was an attempt to protect us from an inundation by an inundation. So
Yeah.
what do you think?
Yeah, I think that public sentiment about science and the role of science in the law is a hugely important part of this story. And I would say two things about it. So first, you're absolutely right that the sort of trajectory in environmental law, which moved in its earliest years from a precautionary principle, right, where we're not sure, but we think this might be bad, so we're going to act, to a sort of ever ratcheting up about how certain and persuasive the risk assessment has to be, right? We need more and more and more science to be able to do the smallest regulatory action. And I think that progression has been really harmful to environmental law. It has also, I think, helped to kind of undermine faith in science because it leads to an environment where you win and lose regulatory fights on the science, right? On kicking something out of the EPA into some peer review body that the industry has helped to fill. And you can fight science with science, and it's a battle of the experts, and everybody gets to weigh in, and the whole process falls apart. Right. So that's the first thing, right? There's been a kind of trajectory within the sort of inner workings of environmental law that has undermined the role of science. And then the second piece is that the practice of science itself has created a lot of skepticism because of early failures in the scientific analysis that supports regulation to be more inclusive and thoughtful about whose experiences and whose voices were going to be reflected in that science, right? So the science itself has been really exclusionary in ways that have exacerbated environmental justice harms for decades, right? So then at the end, we have distrust in science from the right, on the kind of, well, you haven't proven it to me yet, and distrust in science on the left in the, well, you didn't hear about my experience and my voice, and so your science is incomplete. And there's sort of, it gets kind of, then we're sort of left with what's left of science and how can we use it in an effective way. And I think there's a lot of rebuilding there to do.
We have time for one final question.
So I guess kind of going off of that previous question, from your research, how much longer do you see these physical shields? So like such as a fence surrounding a Superfund site, like saying don't enter to prevent your contamination. How do you find these still being meaningful with current research that indicate like the migration of forever chemicals or the latency effects of these chemicals on our bodies?
Yeah, I think local bans and fences to block out toxic chemicals are a joke, right? I mean, I think that their purpose is to make us feel like we're doing something, right? And so if my community doesn't want to have, pesticides applied on the grass at the local elementary school, for instance, right? We can kind of get together and feel like we've protected our children. I don't want to say that's an entirely meaningless action. It's probably better to ban it at the school than not. But it is not solving the problem in any way at all, right? Because most of these instruments of intrusion are migratory, right? And guns are also a really good example of this, right? There are some states that have much more aggressive gun laws, but there's no mechanism to police transportation of guns across state lines, right? So it's one thing to say you can't have it. And when you shoot somebody with it, then that's like an extra charge, but it's not preventative at all.